Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
My name is Bill Medwick. I'm the president of the Table Fort Rodman Military Museum and Veterans Memorial. I'd like to welcome you all here. We have an outstanding guest for the speaker today. And Bob Weddle, our secretary, is going to speak on his behalf now, and then he'll start his presentation. Remember that we have more coming up. We have a list of them on the desk. Coming up all the way to December, we're not going to have anybody because that's just too hectic. But we're going to have more on in January, February, March. We already have set up. I don't have anything on April yet, but we'll do that. And then everybody knows that in May we have to stop again because they start charging for parking. Yeah, so we have a big problem with parking after that. We're also starting next Sunday, the 24th. If you have grandkids, kids, things like that, who like to paint, we now have a new thing coming up from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. We paint your own tank. We have little M1 tanks. They can come in, it's non-toxic paints. They can paint the tank, and they can take it home. I even bought paper bags so they can put it in there so they don't get paint inside mom and dad's car. Again, Bob Weddle, come up from it.
Good afternoon, all.
Good
Thank you
afternoon.
for being here. It's my privilege and an honor to introduce Colonel Weddle. This is his third visit to our museum and or the Civil War Roundtable. And today he will be talking about the Battle of Saratoga. But I do want to give you a little background of Colonel Weddle. His PhD is he's a professor of military theory and strategy at U.S. War College, Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He is a native Minnesotan, graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, served 29 years as a combat engineer officer. Throughout his career, he worked in a variety of command and staff positions in the United States and overseas. He's a veteran of Operations Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and Operation Enduring Freedom. Colonel Weddle's assignments included service as a platoon leader, assistant battalion operations officer, company executive officer, company commander, tours of duty at West Point, Germany, Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Pentagon. Quite a pedigree of command assignments. He has served as Deputy Dean of Academics and held the General Maxwell D. Taylor Chair in the Profession of Arms at West Point. He also has earned the Army War College's Excellence in Teaching Award. I know that he has led several civilian groups to quite a number of battlefields here in the United States and in, for example, France. Holds his master's degree in history and civil engineering from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in history from Princeton. He has written several books, and today it is my honor to introduce Colonel Weddle. Colonel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. It's because there's two microphones. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Bob, and it's really great to be back here for the third time. I love this. I love this place. There's so much crammed in such little space. It's really cool. So kudos to Bill and Bob and everybody involved in all that. And thank you all for coming out on a gorgeous day. You could be doing something else. You could be watching football or something. So I really appreciate that. So the Saratoga campaign was one of the most pivotal military campaigns in American history. It lasted almost 5 months. There were 10 battles and engagements that were involved in that campaign. So it wasn't just a battle of Saratoga, which is what a lot of people call it, but it was really much, much more than that. The personalities involved were as fascinating as you'll ever run into. It played out over hundreds and hundreds of square miles. It was one of the longest campaigns in American history. But more important than that, it changed the very character of the American Revolution. So my new book on Saratoga, which by the way you can order on Amazon, it's available on Amazon in both paperback and hardcover. It examines the campaign in all of its intricacies. I mean, I talk about the political lead up and the context and the aftermath and the whole 9 yards. But for what I'm going to do today, because we only have a short amount of time to cover a bunch of stuff, we're only going to be kind of flying along at wave top level. But what I want to do is at least talk about the conduct of the campaign and hopefully pull out some key points for you as we're going along. And of course, I hope you read the book and maybe I can fill in some gaps during Q&A. So in late August 1777, Britain's King George III received momentous news. And these great tidings so thrilled him that he burst into his wife's chamber, waving the message in the air and exclaiming, "I have beat them. I have beat the Americans." Now, what he had just learned was that Lieutenant General John Burgoyne and his mixed army of British regulars, German regulars, Canadian militia, and Native Americans had just seized the great fortress at Ticonderoga. I'm sure some of you have been there, and that's, of course, a picture of Ticonderoga there. So this victory, achieved with almost no casualties, convinced the king and his ministers that the military strategy that they had put into place the preceding spring to end the American Revolution was going exactly according to plan. But less than 2 months after the king's impromptu celebration, the Burgoyne and his army had met with an unprecedented disaster in British history, and the British were subsequently faced with a very, very different war. So what I want to do, I don't want to talk about the causes of the war or anything like that, but I do want to, just to give you a little context, just talk very, very briefly, just in a minute or so, about what happened before that. Of course, in Lexington and Concord, April 75, this audience doesn't need to be told anything about that. You're, of course, well aware. The first seizure, the U.S. will seize, or excuse me, the Americans, there's not the U.S. yet, but the Americans will seize Fort Ticonderoga in May of 75. Washington takes command in July of 75. That's, of course, also the birth of the United States Army, at the time the Continental Army. And of course, they besieged Boston and forced the British to leave. Also, Quebec, Benedict Arnold tries to take Quebec and General Montgomery, and they fail in December of 75. The Brits will try and fail to seize Charleston in February of 76. The Brits will evacuate Boston in March of 76. Note my excellent use of PowerPoint skills there. That's what happens when you get assigned to the Pentagon. You have to learn PowerPoint. And then, of course, they will come back. The Brits will come back with a vengeance and land in Staten Island. And then, of course, you'll have the battles of Long Island and New York City. Washington and his army will be pushed off Manhattan, and they'll start retreating across New Jersey as the army starts to melt away. And it looks like the revolution is going to end. General Howe, the new British commander-in-chief, will chase him very, very cautiously, though, and will allow Washington to escape. The British will try to invade from Canada, and they'll be stopped mainly because of the weather in October 76, but that was also the Battle of Valcour Island, if you're familiar with that. Benedict Arnold is also involved in that. And then finally, Washington will turn the tide, not so much turn the tide, but slow down the tide of the British advance, and he'll stop the bleeding, basically, of the army, the U.S. Army, by this time, because it's December 76 after the Declaration, at the battles of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton in December 76 and January of 77. So the strategic situation at the end of 76, early 77, is the British have New York City, and George Washington and the army have barely escaped. So the British are looking at, let's end this thing, okay? Let's quit messing around. Let's end this war. And so let's come up with a good strategy for 1777 to end this thing once and for all. Now, one of the most fascinating, I think, misunderstood things about the Saratoga campaign and what happens in 1777 just in general is how the military strategy played out. These are the primary the primary British architects of the military strategy in 1777. Of course, you have the king. He's heavily involved. He's got his hands in that. Yes, he is a constitutional monarch, so he doesn't have supreme power or anything like that, but he is heavily involved. You have the commander-in-chief in North America, which is General Sir William Howe, right there. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, who now is in London. He was the second in command in Canada, and now he's in London. And this guy here is Lord George Germain. He is the Secretary of State for the Colonies. He's the British minister responsible for managing the war in North America. So these are the primary architects of this British military strategy for 1777. Now, Howe and Burgoyne will present two very different plans for how to end the war in 1777. Let's start with Burgoyne. This is Burgoyne's plan. Burgoyne's plan calls for 3 converging columns. So the main army coming down from Canada, basically along Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River invasion route all the way to Albany. A supporting force also coming down from Canada into Lake Ontario and then down the Mohawk River, also converging on Albany. And then coming up from New York City is the main army. Again, everybody's converging at Albany, and then the idea was we'll conduct future unspecified operations into New England. The idea was, the main idea, kind of the fundamental concept here, is to get control of the Lake Champlain, Lake George, Hudson River corridor and split what was thought to be the more rebellious New England colonies away from the rest of the colonies. So that was the idea. And so they thought that if they could subdue New England, the rest of the colonies would kind of die on the vine. So that was the idea. Very complex, as you might guess. In fact, I think it would be hard to pull off today, especially when not even considering things like distance and weather and wilderness terrain, which is, of course, what it was at the time. But the king and Germain really liked it. They thought it was a great plan, and so they embraced that wholeheartedly. Now, Howe's plan was quite different. Remember, he is the commander-in-chief. He is sitting here in New York City. And what he has come to understand, being the guy on the ground, is that George Washington and his army is now the center of gravity of the American Revolution. He thinks that the only way you're going to beat the Americans and put down this revolution is to destroy Washington and his army. So if you want to think of an analogy, think of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the American Civil War. I mean, there was no way that Civil War was going to end until Robert E. Lee and that army was somehow subdued. Same thing. That's what Howe has decided. So what he wants to do is seize Philadelphia, the nominal American capital, and then he thinks that what Washington will do is defend the capital, and that will give him the opportunity then to destroy the American army. So, but what he decides to do, what he proposes, that he's going to load up his army on Royal Navy ships and go all the way around up the Chesapeake Bay and attack Philadelphia from the south. So that's his plan. His brother commands the Royal Navy in the area, so there won't be any problem with cooperation between the two. And then once he seizes Philadelphia, then he assumes Washington will come and defend it, and then he will have his great decisive victory. So as you can see, 2 very, very different plans. So it's up to the leadership in London to kind of figure out, well, which one are we going to go with, or somehow, how are we going to kind of kludge those together and have one unified military strategy for 1777? Now the problem, what I call the tyranny of distance and time, there's a big problem. How are you going to coordinate that when you have the key decision makers, one, really important one, the commander-in-chief, sitting there in New York City, and the rest of these guys are sitting there in London. They're over 3,000 miles away, and it can take a message 2 months to go one way. So imagine, how are you going to, it's going to make it very difficult to coordinate that strategy. And as you might expect, there's going to be problems with that. Messages will pass. Responses will pass in the night as they're going back and forth across the Atlantic. In fact, I have an appendix in my book where I trace every letter, every order going back and forth, and there were dozens of them, back and forth between London and New York City And you can just, and I trace when they were sent, when they were received, when the reply came back, when that was received, and so on and so forth. And you can just follow the breadcrumbs and you can see how the strategy just falls apart because of misunderstandings, late orders, and so forth. And what ends up happening is, again, it's up to this guy to coordinate that strategy. So what they end up doing is Germain and the king end up approving Burgoyne's plan. Okay, that's fine. They also approve Howe's plan. But they tell Howe, once you seize Philadelphia, then go help Burgoyne. But Howe doesn't receive those instructions until he's already at sea. And it's too late for him to do much of anything once he's at sea. It all gets very, very confusing, as you might expect. But the biggest problem was there is nobody's overall in charge, and there is no overall military strategy. There's two utterly separate military strategies. And that's gonna cause problems. And I argue in my book that almost everything that happens in the Saratoga campaign happens because of this faulty strategy. All right, so let's go on. Let's very quickly, Burgoyne, now after he gets his orders, Burgoyne comes back to Canada and he links up with his army there. And Burgoyne and his almost 10,000 man army will depart from Canada on the 14th of June, 1777. They'll arrive outside Fort Ticonderoga on the 2nd of July. Brigadier General Barry St. Leger is the guy commanding the supporting force. He's got about 2,000 men. He'll leave on the 23rd of June, and he'll arrive at the head of the Mohawk River on the 2nd of August. Howe's main force, remember, his plan was approved, right? So Howe's main force don't set sail until they load on ships on the 8th of July, but they can't set sail for 3 weeks because of contrary winds. So they're just sitting on a ship, a bunch of ships. To include their animals. So their animals start dying and starving and getting sick, and so they have all sorts of problems. They don't actually set sail for Philadelphia until the 23rd of July, and they don't land at the head of the Chesapeake Bay till a month later, 25th of August. The main American army is in New Jersey. That's commanded by George Washington, of course, and then the Northern Army, the American Northern Army, to include Ticonderoga, and the entire vicinity up there is commanded by Major General Philip Schuyler. So here are the comparison of forces. So you can see it's about 7,000 Americans to about 10,000, 10,500 Brits and all these other folks here. Major General Philip Schuyler, he is the American. He's commanding the American Northern Department and the Northern Army. He's a native New Yorker. He lives near Saratoga. Of course, nobody thought that was important at this time, but it, of course, becomes important. He was an upper-class patrician. He came across as kind of haughty. He wasn't particularly well-liked, especially by militia troops and especially by New England militia troops. They just did not like him, did not trust him at all. Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, I think that is one of the coolest pictures I have ever seen of a 17th century or 18th century military guy. He's a career British cavalry officer. He's known to be very, very aggressive, kind of flamboyant. He can also be pretty arrogant and pompous, but he's very, very, very well liked by his troops, which is kind of unusual for that period of time in the British Army. He served in America early in the American Revolution, but he didn't have much respect for Americans or American soldiers. And this was magnified after his very easy capture of Ticonderoga. He's a playwright, actually a very successful playwright. He's a member of Parliament, and he's a favorite of King George III. But despite serving almost his entire adult life in the British Army, this is his first independent command, and it's going to be quite a challenge for somebody who's doing that for the first time. So let's take a look at how this plays out. So as I already mentioned, Burgoyne and his army depart Canada on the 14th of June. They arrive at Fort Ticonderoga, or outside Fort Ticonderoga, on the 2nd of July. So that's Fort Ticonderoga. That's the American commander, Arthur Sinclair, Major General Arthur Sinclair. He is a former British Army officer. Like there were several of these guys in the American Army. Burgoyne arrives on the 2nd of July, and he moves his army to invest the main fort and the fortifications across the lake on Mount Independence. So let me just point these out here to you. These are, that's where the main fort was. Additional fortifications are across the lake, on the other side of the lake at called Mount Independence. So Ticonderoga, this is a very large hill just overlooking the fort called Mount Defiance. The Americans had built a bridge and obstacles across the lake, and there was still some remnants of the American fleet that had fought at the Battle of Valcour Island six months before. And the British, of course, have their fleet, which is helped transport the army from Canada. So as the British start surrounding the fort on this side, as the forces come down, they're also, what you can't see here is they're on this bank of the lake as well. They notice this hill. They notice this huge hill, and they notice that the Americans haven't put anybody up on top of that hill. And so the British second in command, a guy named Phillips, who's also a career artilleryman, he said, let's get some guns up on top of that hill. And some of his officers say, well, sir, only a goat can get up that hill. And supposedly Phillips responded, where a goat can go, a man can go. And where a man can go, you can drag a gun. And so they did. So they basically bushwhack a path up through basically it follows where the current park path is today. Some of you, again, may have seen that up there. And they drag guns to the top of Mount Defiance, looking directly down on the fort. Actually, you can almost look inside the fort when you're standing up there. So now the Americans are in big trouble. They basically wake up the next morning under the gun. And Sinclair orders an immediate evacuation. And so they do. So the Americans will evacuate across to Mount Independence and then continuing on the military road south and east. The Brits will wake up. They'll find the Americans gone. American ships will also head south on the lake. They find the Americans gone, and they quickly occupy the fort. They occupy Mount Independence over here, and they quickly make short work of the obstacles that the Americans had spent months and months and months building. And of course, if you're not covering them by fire, it's easy to take them down and dismantle them. And they do very, very quickly. Within the space of a couple hours, they undo months of work. And the Brits are able to quickly occupy the fort and give chase to the Americans as they're trying to get away. And then also they will chase after the Americans on shore, on the water. So that's a photo I took, that's in the book. That's a photo I took from Mount Independence looking across at Mount Defiance. So you can see how it's quite a large hill there. That's where they put the guns, right up there. That's another view. This is the top of the mountain. You can see, you can look right down on the fort. So cannons could easily range the fort and Mount Independence, which is over across the lake here. That picture is also in my book. So right there. And that's Mount Independence looking across the way to Fort Ticonderoga. And that picture is also in the book. Okay, so the Brits very, very quick. So in a matter of days, Burgoyne had taken possession of the great fortress at Ticonderoga. It's impossible to overstate the negative impact this had on the Americans. They're absolutely appalled that Schuyler and Sinclair would have allowed this to happen when they were told that the fort was basically impregnable. And also the easy victory kind of fed into Burgoyne's overconfidence and hubris as well, because he believed that this was going to be the hardest part of the entire campaign. He thought this could take him weeks to seize Ticonderoga, but instead he seizes it in a couple days, so he thinks, oh wow, this is going to be a cakewalk. It's going to be very easy for me to get down to Albany. In fact, he writes to his boss back in London saying, hey, after we get done, can I have some leave? So, I mean, this is a guy who's not worried about getting down to Albany. All right, so St. Leger, in the meantime, let's talk about what he did. He departs Canada on the 23rd, and that as he approaches the Mohawk River, he encounters Fort Stanwix, an old, what was thought to be basically abandoned French and Indian fort. Well, it turns out it was now manned by 750 plucky Americans. And so he realizes he can't just bypass them because there's really no way to do that, so he has to take that fort. So the Americans are outnumbered 3-1, worse odds than those faced by the Americans at Ticonderoga, and St. Leger will start a siege there at at Fort Stanwix. That is, if I don't know if any of you have been in that area, but I highly recommend it. The Park Service has completely rebuilt the fort to look exactly like it did at the time of this campaign. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool visit there. It's outside of present-day Rome, New York. Of course, there wasn't a city there or anything like that. This is, let me just, here's St. Leger coming down, Lake Ontario, and then Fort Stanwix, where he will conduct his siege. All right, so I'll continue on then. So St. Leger tries to get the Americans to give up. They say, we're going to put you all to death if you don't surrender. And this a very young colonel, a 26-year-old colonel named Peter Gansevoort, just basically gives him the middle finger and says, no way, you're not going to take this fort. We're here to defend it to the end. And he does. He's able to hold out despite being heavily outnumbered for 22 days. Now, an American militia force was sent to relieve them, and they come up the Mohawk River on a road next to the river, and they are ambushed by a detachment of mainly Native Americans, but also some British British regulars. They're ambushed and almost destroyed. This is the famous Battle of Oriskany, if you've ever heard of that battle. That takes place during the Saratoga campaign here. Despite the fact that it's kind of a British victory, they lose lots of men. I mean, it's hugely costly. In fact, it's the bloodiest battle of the American Revolution in terms of percentage of soldiers engaged. And one of the things that really hurt St. Leger is he loses lots and lots of Indian warriors. Now, the North American Indian, especially these are Mohawks primarily, Iroquois, they can't afford to lose lots of warriors. And so they lose a lot at Oriskany, and that hurts their morale, and so they desert en masse after this. So St. Leger is now in trouble. And then he hears that there's another American relief force heading towards Stanwix, commanded by Benedict Arnold. In fact, there was, and he very quickly will load up his guys and leave. Not quite that quickly, but fairly quickly. So Arnold will go to the fort, he'll make sure they're okay, and then he will rush back and join the army north of Albany. All right. So St. Leger's now, his column is gone. So now Burgoyne is basically on his own because Howe, of course, is heading for Philadelphia. So now we're going to zero in on this box that will cover the remainder of the operation. But very quickly, I just want to talk very briefly. So you have two commanders-in-chief involved here. You have, of course, George Washington, the American, and you've got General Howe, the Brit. Now, you might be wondering, well, you know, why are you talking about Washington here in the Saratoga campaign? He's 300 miles away in New Jersey. You know, why do we care? Well, because in my research, I found that one of the most important characters of this whole campaign, and ones that historians who've written about Saratoga hardly even mention, is George Washington. Because as commander-in-chief, he's looking at the entire scope of the war. He's not just worried about Philadelphia, even though that's his immediate concern, being the commander of the army down there. He's looking at everybody, and so he provides all sorts of assistance to Schuyler, who's up having to face Burgoyne's advance. Howe, on the other hand, he basically ignores Burgoyne, his subordinate, who, when he moves into, as soon as he nears Ticonderoga, he's technically under Howe's command at that point. But Howe basically doesn't even pay any attention to him. So basically you have one guy who's really acting as a commander-in-chief and another guy who's not. He's acting as an army commander, you know, focused on destroying Washington, but not as an overall commander-in-chief. So I thought that was very interesting. Washington unselfishly will send some of his best officers and men up to help Schuyler. He'll send Benedict Arnold. He'll send Benjamin Lincoln, kind of the forgotten man of the Saratoga campaign, but very important because he had Massachusetts in particular, militia really liked him. They also liked Benedict Arnold, which Washington hoped would kind of counteract some of their dislike of Schuyler. He sends his most elite force. Think think 18th century, SEAL Team 6 or Delta Force, and that was Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen. He sends him up from the main army to join Schuyler's army up there. So he's a really important guy in this overall story. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of, if you can follow with me here, I'm going to talk about the rest of the campaign. I've got a little date, little temperature thing that you'll see as we're going along and how things play out. Just to give you a little orientation. This is the tail end, the southern end of Lake Champlain. Here's Lake George here, and then the Hudson River here. So you can see why this is really an important area for any military, and actually goes back all the way to when Champlain discovered it. So this is a really important route for any organization either heading north or south to or from Canada. So when Burgoyne seizes Ticonderoga on the 6th, and the Americans are trying to escape to the east, a British pursuit will catch them at a place called Hubbardton, and that'll be the only Revolutionary War battle fought in Vermont during the course of the war. Hubbardton's important. The Americans, although the British win that battle, the Americans are able to stop the pursuit. And so it allowed the rest of the garrison to get away. And most of those soldiers will fight at the big battles of Saratoga later on in September and October. So the Battle of Hubbardton takes place. The Americans will continue to retreat. And then Burgoyne will also chase away some Americans at Skenesboro, which is the southern tip of Lake Champlain, present-day Whitehall, New York. And then Burgoyne will stay at Skenesboro, kind of consolidate the army. He'll stay there for a couple weeks, and the rest of the American army will link up with Schuyler and the rest of the army down here at a place called Fort Edward. And then finally Burgoyne will start moving south. He'll move south till he gets to Fort Edward, where he'll stay another 2 weeks. And then you can see Schuyler will move the army away from Burgoyne as Burgoyne is heading south. Now, Schuyler does a pretty good job delaying Burgoyne. He, because of Schuyler's intimate knowledge of this whole area, he's able to order soldiers to obstruct these very, very narrow routes that Burgoyne has to move this entire army on, to include all their logistical trains and their carts and their horses and oxen and everybody else dragging along behind him. And so it really slows him down. That's why he takes 2 weeks at Skenesboro, another 2 weeks at Fort Edward. He also starts to run into logistical problems because he's left Canada without enough transport and without enough supplies. Now you may be wondering, that sounds pretty stupid. He actually does it, he understands what he's doing. He knows he's leaving without enough. So maybe in the Q&A, ask me why he does that. There is a decent reason why he actually does that. Well, again, Schuyler's doing a pretty good job, but the messages that he's sending back to Washington, his boss, and also Congress, which his other boss, he's sending messages back that are just as panicky and as desperate as you'd ever want to read. When you read through these, and of course I read through every single one, as you read through these, you're going, wow, this sounds like a guy on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In fact, he's doing a decent job, but that's not being conveyed to his bosses. And finally, at the beginning of August, they relieve him of command. Number one, because he's lost Ticonderoga as the guy in overall charge up there. But number two, it looked like he was just out of his depth and he just did not know what to do, despite Washington trying to buck him up, giving him advice, telling him what to do, and sending these other senior leaders up there to help him out. But Schuyler it's just not working. So he is relieved. Okay, first Burgoyne is going to continue on to Fort Miller, where he'll stay another 3 weeks at Fort Miller, trying to gather enough logistics. He'll be replaced by this guy, Horatio Gates. Horatio Gates is another former British Army officer, but he wasn't one of these kind of elite guys. In the British Army, class was really, really important. And Gates is not an elite, upper-class, aristocrat guy. He wasn't a rich guy. He was more of a middle-class, lower middle-class guy. And so he's very frustrated with it. He serves very well. He serves with Washington, actually, in the French and Indian War. And he does a good job. He's a pretty capable guy, especially he's really good with logistics and things like that. But he has no chances for advancement. So he ends up resigning his commission. He sells his commission. That's what they did. He sells his commission as a major. He comes over, he gets married, comes over, and settles in North America. Actually asks Washington his advice on building a small plantation in Virginia. And he basically becomes Americanized. So when the war begins, he's an American. So he goes ahead and he offers his services to Washington. Washington gratefully accepts because of his experience. So he quickly becomes the adjutant general of the Continental Army when it's around Boston. But he desperately, really, really wants an independent command. So he gets it here when they replace Schuyler with Horatio Gates. So by mid-August now, Burgoyne's logistical situation is extremely dire. So he decides to send a large detachment of mostly his German troops to seize food and transport known to be at Bennington, Vermont. So this is his detachment, then he'll send off to Bennington, Vermont. But they are intercepted and destroyed by an American force of mostly militia on the 16th of August, the famous Battle of Bennington, which I'm sure you've heard of. So a militia force basically destroys this force of German regulars there just outside of Bennington. So the British Burgoyne loses 1,000 men basically in one day. Now most of them were captured, not killed, but still he loses those guys. So he's lost 1,000 guys right there. He's had to leave detachments of soldiers behind to guard his lines of communications all the way back to Ticonderoga and then all the way back to Canada. So again, he really has some decisions to make now after that. In the meantime, Gates has taken over the American army, and he's starting to slowly, cautiously moving it up the west bank of the river. He knows that if Burgoyne continues to march south, he's going to have to cross over to the west bank because that's the only place where there's a road network that heads south. You can't really, and these armies have to stick to the road. Well, armies today have to pretty much stick to the road for the most part as well. So he moves up, Gates will move up. He will continue to move up until he finds a good piece of defensible ground. Gates is a very defensive-minded guy. So he finds a nice defensible place called Bemis Heights, and there he'll dig in, basically be a blocking force if Burgoyne comes that way. Well, in the meantime, while Gates is doing that, Burgoyne has to make a decision. Do I continue on after all these setbacks, after my logistical issues, after losing 1,000 guys at Bennington? And he decides, yep, I'm gonna push on. So he does. He crosses over to the West Bank, as Gates anticipated he would, and he'll continue south. Now, the two, and by doing that, he basically cuts his line of communications back once he crosses the river. So he heads south, and he will, the two armies will clash at the Battle of Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, 1777. And although the British will lose, it's a very bitter fight there at Freeman's Farm. And although the British suffer casualties that amounted to 3 times the American losses, the British will hold the ground, and thus they could claim a nominal victory. So the British and the Germans, Burgoyne's army loses almost 1,000 men. The Americans lose about 300. So the Americans come off much the better in this battle. But again, the Brits hold the ground so they can claim a victory. So now Burgoyne is faced with another big decision. Do I continue on after sustaining more losses? Remember, the Americans can replace their losses. The Brits can't replace theirs. So do I continue on, or do I fall back, or what do I do? So he decides to dig in, and he's going to wait. And while he's digging in, Sir Henry Clinton throws him a lifeline. Now, who is Sir Henry Clinton? Sir Henry Clinton is Howe's second in command. He's left him behind in New York City while he went to Philadelphia. And Clinton's major role is to hold on to New York City, defend New York City. But his secondary role is, Howe tells him before he leaves, look, if you find an opportunity to assist Burgoyne, knock yourself out. But it was that kind of order. You know, it was really kind of wishy-washy. He doesn't say, yeah, you got to go do it or anything like that. So all the messages that Clinton had received from Burgoyne, it was everything's going great, everything's going swimmingly, stuff's going well. Then all of a sudden he gets a message from him saying, oh crap, I'm in deep, deep trouble. And so Clinton was shocked. And so he says, well, you know, would it help if I came up the river and maybe tried to, you know, relieve some of the pressure off you? And Burgoyne basically says, oh God, yes, please. Please come and help. So Clinton can't go right away, but once some reinforcements arrive from England, he has enough troops to defend New York City, and so that's Clinton down here. That's him right there. And so he decides to help out Burgoyne. So he pulls some guys together, and with about 3,000 men on transport vessels, accompanied by 3 warships, he sails up the Hudson River. He goes up to the Hudson River until he runs into Forts Montgomery and Forts Clinton, American forts, leading to the opening of the Hudson Highlands. If you've ever been to West Point, just south of the West Point main gate is where these forts were. And he quickly makes short work of the forts, and he continues on. And they burn at the time, the New York Capitol at Kingston, right there. They burn it to the ground. But they start running into all sorts of American militia everywhere, and so they decide it probably isn't a good idea to keep going, and so they turn around and go back. So the closest they get is about 70 miles from Burgoyne. None of the messages even though Clinton tries to send in messages and updates, none of them get through the American lines. So Burgoyne thinks Clinton's coming to his rescue, but Clinton never gets there. So while all this is going on, Burgoyne is forced to reduce his rations. He ends up reducing his rations 3 times. Every time he sends out forces to try to find some food and forage from food, there's Americans everywhere. Because by this time now, the American militia is really coming out. At the Battle of Freeman's Farm, these 2 units were about equal, about 6,000 apiece on the American side and the British side. By the time you get into October, now the Americans are up to about 11,000, 12,000, and the British Army keeps on dwindling because of desertion, sickness, and so forth. Now, this is a photo I took quite a while ago, but it's a photo from Bemis Heights, and you can see how it overlooks, it's really commanding ground. It overlooks the main road to Albany, which was basically the same main road today. And the Hudson River. So Gates is in really good position there. Now, while all this was happening, there's a lot of drama going on in the American camp as well. Because when Gates writes the report back to Congress in Washington about the Battle of Freeman's Farm, he doesn't mention he isn't effusive enough for Benedict Arnold's taste about how well Benedict Arnold's men fought in that first battle. So Arnold is very upset. Arnold is also a very aggressive guy, so he's very upset with Gates, who's a very defensive-minded guy. He wants to go out and go after them. Gates says, nope, we're going to stay behind our fortifications, let them come to us. So they have this falling out, and it's really almost a comical thing. Their 2 headquarters, remember Arnold is subordinate to Gates, their 2 headquarters are half a mile apart and they're writing letters to each other. And these are nasty letters, and they get nastier and nastier as the days wear on. It started with exchange of profanities in Gates's tent and then degenerated into this war of letters. At this point, again, Gates's army probably numbers about 11,000. Burgoyne is rapidly running out of supplies for his men, and so he decides to personally lead a 1,700-man reconnaissance force out of the fortifications with a 2-fold mission. First, and most importantly, he wants to forage for food, and second, also his animals are dying, so he wants to get fodder for the animal. And second, he wants to see, is there any way possible that I can squeeze past Gates's army and make a dash toward Albany, and there to spend the winter or meet up with Clinton, who he still thought was coming up the Hudson River. So it was clearly a desperate attempt. So we'll talk about that. So this is the battlefield of the the second battle and kind of the final battle of Saratoga. Here you can see Burgoyne now has a little bit less than 6,000. Gates has 11,000 plus. We're not quite sure. The numbers are uncertain because of so many militia are coming in, and the records weren't all that great. So by mid-morning on the 7th of October, 1777, Burgoyne will personally lead this ad hoc reconnaissance force out of their fortifications, and almost immediately they run into an unharvested field of wheat. So they're thrilled about that. So he immediately gets his guys working, cutting the wheat, so he can get. Of course, this is October, so it's harvest time. Get this wheat back to the camp. So that's going swimmingly. But because Burgoyne has lost all of his Indian support, the Americans are able to really get close their reconnaissance, and they spot this movement almost immediately. So Gates will send out Daniel Morgan and his riflemen, basically the same thing he did to start the Battle of Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September. So Daniel Morgan and his riflemen go out and they immediately start picking off British officers, and that's very, very successful. He'll send out a light infantry force as well to help support Morgan and his riflemen, and they start causing heavy casualties. In the face of this strong attack, Burgoyne tries to order an orderly retreat, but one of his aides is shot down and mortally wounded trying to deliver the message, so it doesn't get out right away. Also, Brigadier General Simon Fraser, who was probably Burgoyne's best subordinate commander, is shot in the abdomen and mortally wounded. He'll die in agony that night. So it's chaos all around for the Brits as they try to fall back. Now, right around this time, so let me show you. This is a painting that I got from the British National Army Museum that depicts the funeral of Simon Fraser the next day. So that's Burgoyne right there and his subordinates. And actually there's artillery rounds that you can't, it's hard to see, but there's actually American artillery rounds that are flying around while they're trying to bury Arnold. Now, I briefly mentioned Arnold and Gates having this bitter and kind of juvenile dispute that lasted from immediately after the 17th September Battle of Freeman's Farm until sometime after 3rd of October. Why do I pick 3rd of October? Because all those letters the last letter is exchanged on the 3rd of October between the two. Those kind of nasty letters back and forth. After that, there are no more of those letters. Yet the Battle of Bemis Heights takes place on the 7th. So sometime between the 3rd and the 7th, these two guys reconcile. Now, the standard account of Saratoga is that Gates relieved Arnold of his command, put him under arrest because he refuses to leave the camp, and that when Arnold hears the shooting on the 7th of October, he rushes out, runs to the battlefield, takes control, wins the battle while Gates is cowering in his tent. That's the standard account. That's the account you'll read on virtually every account of Saratoga. It's a cool story. It's too bad it's not true. Because we know now from new evidence and combined with old evidence that, again, they had somehow reconciled between the 3rd and the 7th, and that we have a eyewitness that this is that's Benedict Arnold, that's Gates, and this is the famous Boot Monument at Saratoga without Arnold's name on it because of his later treason. Well, let me just skip ahead. Okay, so as the Brits are falling back, Arnold, who's out there, who Gates had sent out with the forces, he didn't run out by himself. He didn't take it upon himself. Gates, he was still in command. He had never been relieved of his command. Arnold comes riding back. So Gates is basically in the fortifications here. He's managing the battle. He's not leading the battle, but he's managing the battle. He has let Arnold kind of fight the battle up here. Arnold comes riding back, and we have an eyewitness letter that just came to light a few years ago, an eyewitness letter that says he rode back into the fortifications, went riding up to Gates, and he said, let me find the quote, it's a great quote. "It is late in the day, but let me have some men, and we will have some fun with them before sunset." So Gates readily agrees. He sends another couple brigades forward, and Arnold will personally lead these guys into an attack. So the British have fallen back in disarray, back into their fortifications. The Americans will keep pressing them. This is Arnold. Keep pressing them, and Arnold will lead several attacks up against these fortifications. First, he'll go against the light infantry redoubt right here, but then he'll notice that there's a great opening up here between the light infantry redoubt and this German camp right up here. And so he's able to personally lead this charge right between the two, and he breaks the British lines right there. Brilliant operation on the part of Arnold. So what happens is now there are Americans who have seized this position right here, and now Burgoyne has no choice. He has to fall back. There's nothing else he can do. And so he orders a retreat. And there they are retreating. So they'll retreat up to a place called Sword's House, and that's where they will sit for the night while Burgoyne's trying to figure out what to do. Now, as Arnold led this charge into the German positions, this is the cover painting on my book. This is supposed to depict Arnold leading the attack into the German fortification. And as you can see, the sun is setting in the west there. And unfortunately for Arnold, as he charges in there with his horse, he is seriously wounded. His horse is killed. He is seriously wounded in the leg, a leg he had already had injured during the Canadian campaign. The horse falls on top of him, and he sustains a horrific wound to his leg. It's amazing it didn't have to be amputated. So Arnold plays a huge role in this great victory at Bemis Heights, but he was following Gates's direction throughout, and Gates was still firmly in command and managing the overall conduct of the battle. So Gates deserves to be known as the victor of Saratoga in my mind, with a solid assist from his very aggressive subordinate Benedict Arnold. And in fact, Gates, when he writes his report of this battle, he's effusive in his praise of Arnold. And he certainly wouldn't have done that had Arnold disobeyed orders and done all these insubordinate things that the story has said in the past. So in the end, Arnold did indeed have some fun with them before sunset. Well, as a result of Arnold's successful attack, Burgoyne had no choice but to retreat north. And so he does, because the Americans are on his flank. Burgoyne's exhausted army will trudge north in a cold, driving rain. The soldiers, in their reminiscences, will say that they never forgot that miserable night as they were trying to get away from the Americans, who were right on their heels. Very, very soon, they grind to a halt at a place tiny little place called Saratoga. They grind to a halt at Saratoga. They can go no farther, and very, very quickly, the Americans surround them, and it's basically over. After several days of tense negotiations, terms were agreed on the 16th of October, and the next day, only 15 weeks after seizing the great fortress at Ticonderoga, and while an American band played Yankee Doodle, John Burgoyne surrendered his 6,000-man army to Horatio Gates, as this is depicted in the famous John Trumbull painting, one of those great monumental paintings that hangs in the Capitol Rotunda today. And you can see, here's Gates, there's Burgoyne, there's his second-in-command, Phillips, the guy who got that artillery up on top of the hill, and in the very conspicuous white coat, that's Colonel Morgan of the Riflemen. And there's Schuyler. Schuyler, although he had been relieved, he didn't stay with the army, but he went down to Albany and made sure that the army continued to get supplies. So he was, that's a really good. It reflects very, very well on General Schuyler. So what were the strategic implications of this? What are you looking at here? Of course, everybody recognized Benjamin Franklin there and George Washington. This is King Louis XVI of France. So the American triumph of Saratoga was pivotal in many ways and resulted in significant long and short-term consequences. So short-term consequences, the British only have 2 armies in North America. They've just lost one. So this is the first time a British army has surrendered. The next time they surrender an army will be at Singapore in 1942. So it's a big deal. Morale in the United States obviously soars. Brit morale plummets. Opposition in Parliament, and there is a vocal, although small, opposition group in Parliament that is against the war. They're not so much for American independence, but they're against the war, and there are some who are for American independence. They become emboldened, they gain support in Parliament, and the Brits become desperate. In fact, they offer Americans basically what looks like Commonwealth status today. They basically said, you can have everything you want except independence. Well, after Saratoga, the Americans basically said, no, sorry. If you had come to us 2 years ago, we probably would have accepted that, but not now. Long-term implications, the most important long-term implication really happens very, very quickly after this, because Louis XVI orders that negotiations be reopened with the American diplomatic delegation led by Benjamin Franklin there in Paris. And on the 6th of February, they sign a treaty of alliance. We sign a treaty of alliance with France. So that's huge. So we finally have a major European power that's on our side. Of course, the French, they don't care about us. They care about getting after the Brits. And of course, this is a way to weaken the Brits. And now the war becomes a global war between major powers in Europe, with Britain and of course us. And the Brits almost look at us as a secondary theater after the alliance is laid out. Now, Winston Churchill once famously said that the only thing worse than fighting with an ally is fighting the only thing worse than fighting with an ally is fighting without one. And the Americans quickly discovered the truth of that. Because the French on our side wasn't a cure-all, and they proved to be pretty difficult to deal with. Still, they started with welcome naval support right off the bat. And in 1780, the French will land an army in America that would ultimately combine with Washington's army, ending in the final and decisive American victory at Yorktown in October of 1781. So, quite simply, the Americans could never have had a Yorktown without a Saratoga. It didn't have to be Saratoga, but it had to be something like Saratoga in order to get the French to come on our side. And so thus the great victory at Saratoga changed the entire character of the American Revolution. And although Saratoga wasn't sufficient to guarantee American independence, it was necessary. And it was, as one American general wrote the day after Burgoyne's surrender, it was a complete victory. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. That was quick.
You made a statement about the Battle of Saratoga is the only major British surrender.
Yeah.
What would you call Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown?
Yeah, I said the first time a British army surrendered.
I thought you said the next one was in Singapore.
I see.
Singapore.
Yeah, you're right. No, you're right.
Cornwallis, I think, is even a...
No, you're right.
Ended it. I mean, it was 2 years later.
No, you're right. Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah, so that'd be the third one, I guess, the Singapore one. Yeah. Good point. Yes, sir.
I came here from a long way because I have an ancestor that played a lot of parts in this.
Oh, great.
At 16, he went with General Knox up to Ticonderoga.
Okay.
In the cannons to Boston.
Yeah.
Then he became part of the artillery regiment.
Uh-huh.
Washington at one point sent him up to fortify West Point.
Okay.
And he was up there when Burgoyne started to come south. So then he was ordered to join Gates and Arnold. And he was in the artillery then.
Okay.
He was in the artillery for the entire Revolutionary War. But because of all of the records in my family that detailed, being at Ticonderoga, then at Bemis Heights and Freeman's Farm, West Point, it's obvious that he saw a lot of the action there.
Do you have a question?
No, I just
Oh, okay.
wanted to add that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great. That's great. It's great to have that kind of rich family history. Yeah. Anybody have any? Yes, sir.
In the series Adams on HBO,
Yeah.
they talk about the Battle of Saratoga and how they captured all the cannons and brought them back to Boston. Did they ever
Well,
put cannons?
That happened much earlier. That happened in 75. That's not this.
Okay, so they did have cannons at the beginning of the war. The American Army.
Yeah, absolutely. We captured Ticonderoga. Colonel Knox at the time, dragged famously through the winter, dragged the guns to Boston, and once those guns were mounted, that's when Howe, the commander, decided, whoa, we have to get out of here. So yeah, but that happens in 75. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
What did General Howe do after Ticonderoga? I mean, there's a gap there between Saratoga's victory and Cornwallis, down there.
Well, yeah, there's a big gap. There's many years.
Just stay in one spot, try to hold on to Philadelphia?
No. Well, what happens is Howe asks to be relieved. So he seizes, so I didn't talk about Philadelphia because it's not Saratoga, but he seizes Philadelphia. He seizes Philadelphia in late September. The American Congress moves to York, Pennsylvania. And so he occupies, and they fight the Battle of Brandywine and the Battle of Germantown. Both British victories, but not decisive victories. So Washington is able to, save the army. And then Howe thinks that he's not given enough recognition for capturing the American capital, so he asks to be relieved. He is relieved. He's replaced by Clinton, his second in command. They despise each other, by the way. So Clinton becomes second in command. So becomes the commander-in-chief now. So Clinton becomes the guy he's commander-in-chief all the way through Yorktown. He's relieved after Yorktown. Of course, Cornwallis is captured. He's relieved after Yorktown. He's replaced by General Guy Carleton. Carleton is the guy who basically presides over the British evacuation. So basically what happens is after Saratoga and Philadelphia, the theater of war will shift to the south, and that's where most of the rest of the campaigns will take place in the south. So Battle of Cowpens, the Battle of Camden, yeah.
So you mentioned that Burgoyne came down from Canada with very few supplies, or enough supplies to sustain a long campaign. So my question is this: first of all, why? And was it because he thought he was going to get more help from Howe?
Very good. Almost, but not from Howe. Okay. You're almost right there. So he's gathering supplies and stuff, and he wants to make sure he leaves in plenty of time to conduct this operation before the winter. So he doesn't have enough stuff. So he's going, do I hang around here in Canada and continue to gather supplies? And then when I head south, it's too late? Because that had happened the year before, in October of 76 rather. So he doesn't want to reprise that. But what he thinks, and this is where he's making an assumption, and if you've done any military plan or know anything about military planning, there's nothing wrong with making an assumption because nobody has perfect knowledge, right? So you have to assume some things. And so he assumes that everybody thought in Britain that the upper part of New York, actually most of New York, was filled with loyalists, that were anti-war. They were pro-British, anti-war. So he thought, once I head into New York, I'm going to be able to get all the supplies I need from the locals. So I'm going to be able to I'm going to leave with this much. I need that much, but I'm going to be able to fill that in with local support, loyalist support. Well, as it turns out, there may have been plenty of locals up there, but they didn't help him. Most of them will run away when they see these two armies about ready to clash. So most of them will either hide in their cellars or they will evacuate. So he gets some help, but not nearly as much as he needs. So, if he had, my feeling is after he took Ticonderoga, and surprisingly took Ticonderoga as fast as he did, he should have just kept going as fast as he possibly could. I think he probably could have gotten to Albany, because Schuyler was just, he was not ready to respond to a quick advance. Because he stopped for 2 weeks at Skenesboro and then stopped again for 2 weeks at Fort Edward, 4 weeks he gave Schuyler plenty of time to reconstitute the army, kind of pull it together. He takes what was the garrison at Ticonderoga, incorporates them into the other bit of the small army that he had, starts obstructing those routes. He wouldn't have been able to do any of that had Burgoyne continued, just push. But I think he makes 2 mistakes. Number one, he makes a bad assumption. Number two, he isn't aggressive enough. And again, there's nothing wrong with making an assumption, but if you're going to make an assumption that is so important that if it doesn't come true, your operation may fail, you better think hard about what do I do if that assumption doesn't come true. I need to have some sort of a backup, and that's what he does not do. He makes other assumptions like I'm going to get 5,000 Indians to support me. He ends up getting about 1,000. They're very important to him, but he doesn't get enough. He doesn't get nearly as much as he thinks. Yes, ma'am. Does that?
It does. I was just going to follow up. And you might have mentioned, what happened to Burgoyne after?
Yeah. I'll get right to you, ma'am, here in a second. Yeah, it's an interesting story because it's kind of sad, actually. So all these troops, those 6,000, Burgoyne and his army surrenders. And what Burgoyne maybe makes up for poor generalship, he makes up for that by being an excellent negotiator. So when they negotiate the surrender, he's able to insert a clause in there that basically says, that Gates accepts and signs, basically says, the army will be able to go back to England as long as they promise never to fight in North America again. Well, all that means is you go back to England and you take 6,000 guys, fresh guys in England, and send them. So basically you haven't lost anything. So when George Washington reads the surrender document, he is not happy at all. And so what he says, what he tells the generals who are in charge of marching these guys to Boston, because that's what they did. They marched them to Boston from Saratoga, where they were going to get on British ships under flag of truce to send back to London, to England. And so what Washington says is, okay, every other point in that surrender document, if they don't fulfill it absolutely to the letter, we'll say you violated it and you can't go home. And so one of the things said, you have to turn over all the regimental colors. You have to turn over all the, officers' swords, all the small arms, So they found that there were a bunch of regiments that said, we're not giving up our flags, and so they hid their flags. And so the Americans said, you violated the treaty, you're not going home. And so they didn't. So they stayed in America for the duration of the war. And in fact, they became what became known as the Convention Army. Has anybody ever heard that term?
No.
The Convention Army. It's obscure, but it's a cool story. It was called the Convention of Saratoga. It wasn't called the Surrender of Saratoga. It was called the document was called the Convention, because Burgoyne did not want to say capitulation or anything like that to save face. He said, let's call it a convention. Gates said, yeah, I don't care. So they called it a convention. So they called this the Convention Army. And so anytime any British soldiers got anywhere near this 6,000-man POWs, a group of POWs, they would march them someplace else. So they marched them first to Boston, then they ended up marching them to Charlottesville, Virginia. Then they ended up marching them to central Pennsylvania. So if you ever drive down through that area, every now and then you'll see those roadside markers saying, the Convention Army passed through here. And I remember when I was a second lieutenant on my way from Minnesota to Fort Belvoir for my first duty station, I remember seeing all these, I wonder what that is. Now I know. Many of those soldiers loved what they saw in America and stayed, became American citizens after the war. Most of the Germans, vast majority of the Germans, but a lot of the Brits did too. So it's kind of a cool story. But Burgoyne, what Burgoyne does is he gets to Boston, he applies to Washington and says, look, I'm really sick, let me go home. So Washington says, yeah, you can go home. So they let him go home. So he went home, and of course he was immediately, as you can imagine, hey, you just lost an army. So there's a parliamentary inquiry and all that. He basically switches his allegiance from the Tories to the Whigs, stays in Parliament. It's an interesting story, but he then kind of goes back on his hobby of being a playwright, and he's a very successful playwright. He's buried in Westminster Abbey today. So, ma'am, I'm sorry, long-winded answer.
How is it that the British were successful in getting the Native Americans to support them?
Great question.
Versus
Yeah.
our side?
Yeah, great question. So, as the Americans are reproducing very fast during this period. In fact, Franklin writes all sorts of things in the pre-war period, saying, "Yep, it won't be long before we'll be all the way to the Mississippi River and all that." And so the Americans are chomping at the bit to continue to expand westward. And of course, the Indians don't like that. They don't want to do that. And the British promised them that we won't allow the Americans to do that. They're going to go up to, the Appalachian Mountains. We're not going to allow them to go any farther. Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where I live today, was kind of the limit of, civilization at that point, just about. It went a little farther, but not much farther beyond Carlisle, as an example, in Pennsylvania. So most of the Native American tribes, especially the Iroquois, the really warlike tribes that we're talking about in this campaign, they wanted to support the Brits. They wanted the Brits to win. Some Indian tribes were neutral. They played no part. In some, actually, there of the Iroquois Confederacy, there are 6 tribes in the Iroquois Confederacy. 2 were pro-American. So the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras. But they had been very Christianized. And so most historians think that that's probably why they had this tighter connection to the American settlers and, missionaries and clergy and stuff like that. But the rest of the Iroquois Confederacy, they were hardcore supporting the Brits. Yeah. Sir.
Yeah, the War of 1812 was sort of the same arrangement.
Same thing.
Because the Western Americans, they're the ones that wanted to take over Canada.
Yeah.
And push the government to. They had enough power to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
New England didn't want any part of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had...
The commerce was part of it.
Battles and
Yeah.
around the Great
Oh, absolutely. There was
the Thames, I think, where Tecumseh was a leader of the uprising.
Yeah, that actually comes after the War of 1812. But you're right. I mean, the constant movement westward is going to cause all sorts of issues with the Native Americans for sure. And it's starting here. Well, it started before this. But the Pequot Wars and all those things too that you guys are very familiar with living in this area. But yes, sir.
While you're here, you should inquire about the Battle of the John Brown Bell up in Marlborough. It's a comedy of errors.
Well, there's a lot of that during all wars. Anybody else? Well, thank you guys. It's been a great audience. Appreciate it.